Beautification of communication, the Communification Podcast.
Aloha, Dr. Hawkins. Thank you so much for joining me on the Communification Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I really enjoyed reading some of the literature that you've put out. I don't know much about this topic, but it is very interesting to me, and I definitely want to know more. So I feel like as a collective, we could all benefit from learning about collective action, and I'm so excited to have you on the show today. So to start, why don't you tell us a little bit about what drew you to the study of human communication? Why are you interested in this field? Where does your passion come from? What do you study?
Yeah, so I actually started doing research on media and communication and psychology as an undergraduate, so my junior year of college. And it all started by being part of a research lab where we were studying media effects. And so we were studying how watching TV shows like Jersey Shore and Real Housewives could make people more narcissistic. We were studying how playing, violent games like Grand Theft Auto could make people more aggressive. And this was really some of the first times that I started to think about how the media that I consume on a daily basis and how everybody else consumes media, at a very large rate in their daily kind of lives, how this could potentially influence us and affect us. And as I started to continue graduate school, I started to think more in depth about how identity online, through the media, and through social media could potentially affect the ways in which we act in our everyday lives. And that research is really what my passion has been about. I really enjoy the ability to explore questions that I find really interesting. And also, the really great thing about this research is that media is constantly evolving, and social media and how we use it and the content is always evolving. And so, the questions that I'm able to ask and able to explore in my research are also always evolving as well. And I just find that really, really interesting.
It's fascinating. It's a blessing and a curse, though, right? Because you do research and then, MySpace is no longer a thing, or, this new
Yeah,
technology just came out.
yeah, exactly. One of my colleagues was doing research on Yik Yak, which was a popular social media platform, and then it stopped becoming viable and went out of business. And so the research he was doing on it had to change, and now Yik Yak is actually back. And so social media and media more broadly is always changing, and so there's always new questions for researchers and the public to be exploring and asking themselves.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it can get complicated.
Definitely.
Well, to kick off our discussion, I'm wondering if there are any communication theories or models that you can introduce us to. So, to help us basically gain a better understanding or maybe build a foundation for our discussion today.
Yeah, so the one that I use really extensively in my research is something called the social identity model of collective action. So it sounds kind of long and complicated. I usually refer to it as SIMCA. It's usually abbreviated as SIMCA, so I might say it that way a few different times. But what the SIMCA model essentially is trying to understand is what motivates or leads people to being more likely to participate in collective actions. And so this model proposes that three things can be really influential at getting people to go out and participate in various different collective actions. The first thing is identity. So when people have a very strong identity or very strong relationship to a specific identity, if that identity is threatened, they're going to be more likely to want to go out and participate in some type of collective action that benefits that identity. And oftentimes, when we're thinking about different identities in this area, we're thinking about race, we're thinking about gender, we're thinking about religion, but it can be something as simple as your favorite sports team. The next thing that can be really influential for collective action is injustice. So, if a group feels like they are being treated unfairly or they're being treated unjustly, this is going to lead those individuals to want to go out and participate in collective actions that will push back against this injustice or this unfair treatment. And then the last thing that is really influential for collective action is efficacy. And this is this idea that if a group of people or individuals work together, that their working together can actually bring about change. And so, if individuals are high in efficacy, if they think working together will actually make a difference, this is also going to lead them to being more likely to go out and participate in collective actions. And so, again, Simca model proposes that identity, injustice, and efficacy, these are three really important things that help determine if somebody's going to go out and participate in a collective action.
It makes sense to me.
Right.
What are some of those ways that people use the internet for collective action?
Yeah, so the I usually think about social media as having two roles in relation to collective action, social media or the internet. One is that it can act as a facilitator for collective action. So one of the really big things that leads to collective action is when individuals are able to connect with others who might hold similar beliefs or similar ideas. And one thing we know about social media and the internet is that it is really good for bringing people together or allowing them to search out other people, groups who might believe the way that they do. And so that is one way social media can be used in relation to collective action is acting as a facilitator for bringing people together. Social media can also act as a platform where collective actions can actually take place. So, for example, we can think about online petitions and signing them as being a form of collective action. Maybe think about something like change.org in certain situations. Also, things like liking, posting, sharing, commenting in relation to certain movements, demonstrations, protests, or even various different topics can also be forms of collective action. And then also, more recently, we've seen the ability for financial donations directly to certain causes, protests, movements, demonstrations as well, taking place a lot more on social media. And a lot of these different organizations will have like direct links to things like Venmo, PayPal, Patreon on their social media pages, or if there are content creators who are creating, social media around demonstration or protest or a movement, they themselves will oftentimes have these links to direct payment as well. And so these are some examples of the ways in which people might use social media to go out and participate in non face to face collective actions.
One thing that kind of came to mind for me, a girlfriend of mine, her name is Ocean. She has a lot of followers on social media and she's into conservation and educating people about sharks. And she put out links for people to testify in support of a bill to help protect sharks. So that might be another way.
Yeah, perfect example.
Well, that leads me into my next question, which is what are the benefits of using social media for collective action? So, here in Hawaii, our indigenous population of Native Hawaiians, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the movement, but it's called We Are Mauna Kea, and they have an immense social media movement going. I mean, people like The Rock and Jason Momoa, Aquaman, posted about this, and that even translated into support in the offline movement where they visited base camp and participated in cultural practices on site. So maybe you can react to that and also give us some of those benefits that might arise.
Yeah, so I think this goes back to a little bit of what I was saying is this ability to get information out there and connect with others is one of the real benefits of social media and digital media in relation to collective action. You can create this content, educate people, give them information, even when they might not geographically be located close to where an action is actually happening. And this was very, very difficult to do before we had social media. And so this would, I would say, would be a really kind of benefit of social media. And if I think if we think also about kind of what's going on in the world right now, with COVID, it can be somewhat difficult sometimes to participate in person kind of face to face collective actions, or people might not necessarily feel super comfortable doing so. But if they still want to get involved, there are ways through social media to do so. Again, forwarding, links or content to their friends, like I was saying, providing those financial donations. When we have been put in a situation where face-to-face interactions can be a lot more difficult, social media has kind of stepped in and allowed some individuals to still contribute in kind of various ways that, again, without social media, they would have a harder time doing so.
That's a really great point. And on the flip side, for the people that are in or trying to organize, well, I guess, I mean, even if you're not organizing an offline type of event, if you will, it helps them to connect and to organize those activities.
Yeah, exactly.
And then probably also for like marginalized populations that, you know, need a voice.
Yeah, and so some of my research has actually looked at how marginalized populations can use media to push back against the stereotypes that they're experiencing. So, looking at the 2016 presidential election, some of my research looked at how Muslim Americans and the stereotyping and the negativity that was around their group during that election, how viewing that was actually motivational for them to get out there and say, we want to participate in collective actions that push back against these stereotypes, especially if that news or the content that they were viewing around their group, if they saw that as biased, it was motivational for them to go out and want to participate in collective actions that push back against those really negative stereotypes that were being seen on social media and throughout the news more broadly.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, that's amazing that it can help to motivate that type of pro-social collective action to counteract whatever that biasy or whatever it is that you're seeing in the media, might be it. There's the two sides of the coin, right? There's this positive side,
Right.
but there's also this negative side. I mean, why did they have to create the collective action in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So most of us have been at the very least exposed, right, to some of what you just mentioned, and it's not always in a positive way. So communication wise, what are some of the problems that people can encounter or that can occur?
Yeah, so throughout media more broadly, and specifically social media, we see a lot of in group and out group dynamics. And this is what a lot of my research is focusing on, looking at in group, out group dynamics in relation to race, ethnicity, and religion, and also in relation to political ideology and political orientation. And one thing we know is that uh, media, and especially social media, can be very highly polarized, especially in relation to politics. And we've seen more recently in the last few years, even social media platforms coming out that focus in on this. So things like Parler is a good example, or Donald Trump's recent new social media platform, I think it's called Truth Social, as being spaces that are very highly polarized, especially towards right leaning politics. But even platforms like Reddit, we've seen this, which as well. So platforms that are a little bit more mainstream, we've also seen this, and this can be really harmful for a few different reasons. Theoretically or hypothetically, it can lead to things like echo chambers, where people will see, more content that just reinforces the beliefs that they already have. There's a lot of people doing research on this topic to see, kind of are echo chambers, there, and how harmful are they to people. We could even think about the algorithms for these social media platforms and how they might push people down, certain rabbit holes as potentially being harmful as well. But again, these are kind of things that are continually being explored as social media platforms try to like tweak their algorithms to avoid this. There's just more and more research coming out on this like every single day.
So interesting. And what about the spiral of silence? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is this idea that on in media or on social media more broadly, people kind of might start to be fearful or not want to speak out, and so their voices will be silenced. And this can be really problematic, depending on the topic and the context in which this is happening. And sometimes social media platforms and their algorithms might even silence individuals themselves. So there's a lot of research out there on content moderation and talking about the ways in which certain groups, especially like marginalized groups, are oftentimes having their content moderated both by the algorithms of the social media platforms and how people might report their content. I have some really interesting work in progress which explores how Black women oftentimes face more bias on social media platforms for the content that they post that pushes back against stereotypes and things like that. And there's some research out there also talking about how the algorithms from some of these social media platforms might moderate Black women's content more so than other groups. So it can be definitely very, very harmful when we're thinking about the ways in which content and what people post and how they might be trying to engage in counter speech and push back against these really harmful narratives, how their content might particularly be moderated or potentially be moderated.
Wow, I can't wait to hear the results of your research. I will put in the show notes, by the way, everyone, a link to Dr. Ian Hawkins and his work so you can follow his work. My last question when it comes to the problems, and I'm not quite sure if it is a problem because earlier you were talking about how, because of COVID especially, that, we might not feel safe to be offline, to be in
Yeah.
person and create and be a part of those movements and be a part of that collective action. And so we're participating uniquely online. But there is this idea or this notion of slacktivism. So could you define that for us? And is it helpful, harmful, neither, both?
Yeah, so selectivism is this idea that if you're participating in these collective actions like on social media, that you might like not want to go out and participate in them in the real world. And yeah, there's a lot of debate on this, and I don't necessarily think we've come to a 100% conclusion on whether it's good or whether it's bad. And again, I think something like COVID changes this, completely, and just how social media evolving and how much it's become an integrated part of our lives now more than it was 5 years ago. I think that this is continually uh, changing on whether these in-person collective actions are more effective or less effective than these social media or these digital collective actions. I think it's just really for me as a researcher difficult to you know try to nail that down because as I said, you know with COVID in the past 2 years, it just changes things completely. Which is why when we're talking about media and the way it influences us, it's oftentimes really contextual. And contextual on the changes that are happening on social media as well as the changes that are happening in the real world.
The equation just keeps changing.
Right.
Well, I have a question. You may have already answered it, but I wanted to bring in this question from a listener who is a very active. She's very active in social movements. She uses social media to inform and educate people around causes that she believes in. She has extensive experience both as a legal observer and boots on the ground activist. So, this question comes from Summer Star.
Aloha, Dr. Hawkins. Hi, Malika. Amazing research, Dr. Hawkins. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if the research indicates that the increased prevalence of online activism, does that actually translate to a decrease in offline activism, boots on ground activism? I'm not sure. And if so, is there a way to remedy that from boots on ground perspective and or the online perspective? Thank you so much.
Yeah, so kind of related to what we were talking about, and I think that that's a really great question. And again, I don't think there's a general kind of consensus on this about if this online activism is leading to there being like no little to no activism uh, in the real world. And so I think the second kind of follow-up part to that question on how do we connect or how do we remedy this potential disconnect between digital activism and in-person activism is trying to really for these organizations who are trying to organize collective action just more broadly, really for them to try to integrate those two aspects. So trying to make sure they both have that online presence, which we know can be really influential for collective action, as well as the in-person collective actions as well. Integrating these two things together, connecting them, and trying to make sure that your organization or your movement is engaging in both kind of facets or ways of carrying out collective action, I think is probably the most impactful way to go about bringing the change that they're trying to bring about or trying to collectively act on.
That sounds like a powerful tactic there. Summer also had a follow up question for you.
A secondary question to that is, does the research indicate that there's a particular kind of organizational structure within an activist group that provides them more efficacy both in online endeavors and moving those online endeavors into offline real world endeavors? Thank you so much.
Yeah, so another great question and really kind of important question. And so, organizationally, groups that, again, are having this online and offline presence that have some kind of structure to them or somebody trying to help guide both the online and the offline kind of facets are going to be kind of most effective. We've seen some movements not necessarily have this structure, but they've been so large, like Occupy Wall Street, so that they've been effective. But for these potentially smaller organizations or smaller movements that maybe don't have, as many participants in something like as Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter, really trying to get people who are motivated and want to participate and really are engaged with the messaging around the collective action is going to lead to the most kind of benefit and getting people to really go out there and participate.
Well, you've also done research specifically on how white nationalists use the internet to motivate collective action. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so this kind of gets into this two-sided coin that you mentioned earlier. So we've talked so far, a little bit about something like Black Lives Matter and talking about like marginalized groups using social media to push back against stereotypes. These are really like positive ways social media can be used for collective action. But my research has looked at kind of the negative ways social media can be used for collective action as well. And this is my research focusing on how white nationalists use social media. And so, white nationalist groups and kind of far right, alt right groups, they use social media quite extensively and have a very strong presence on these platforms. And so some of my research has examined if these Simca messaging or themes that I talked about earlier, these being identity, injustice, and efficacy, are these themes like present in the content that white nationalists are creating themselves and putting out there? And my research finds that yes. So these alt-right white nationalist groups, in the content that they produce themselves, they're talking about white identity and threats to white identity. They're talking about white injustice or the ways in which they believe or they perceive white people are being treated unfairly in the United States. And they're talking about white collective efficacy, this idea that if white people work together, they can bring about change. And this is in addition to them just specifically talking about white collective action. So, telling white people to go out and participate in protests and things like that and try to bring about change. My research shows that these themes are really present in the content that they're producing. And this is not inconsequential, as my follow up research, which is some survey based research, shows that when white Americans report that they see these themes on social media, it's really influential. So if they say that, yeah, I am seeing a lot of white injustice or white people treated unfairly, this leads to them believing in the real world that white people are actually treated this way or treated unfairly. And as my research also shows, this then motivates them to want to participate in collective actions that exclusively are beneficial to white people. And the really kind of interesting thing about this research as well is that I found these relationships in white Americans who self identified as alt right or white nationalists. So I sampled these individuals, but I also found these relationships in those who self identified as Republicans and those who self identified as Democrats. So when people see these kind of white injustice themes in their social media content, they are very, very influential at influencing people's perceptions and consequently their behavioral collective action intentions. And this doesn't necessarily happen in a vacuum. We can point out the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017. We can also look at the Capitol insurrection riot that happened, just a little bit less than a year ago, as examples of far right collective action, and as hate organizations, anti hate organizations have also found, like the ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Center, far right white nationalist propaganda has been steadily increasing over the last few years. So these relationships between social media content and viewing, things like white injustice or white identity and how they might influence actual perceptions and collective actions, is not inconsequential, and this stuff is not happening just in a vacuum.
That leads me into our final discussion point or question, which is, could you share with us some research based strategies? How can we avoid those types of downfalls that could come from using social media for collective action or just being exposed to that type of collective action?
Yeah, so this is really a difficult thing, something that I'm trying to explore in some of my current work and some of my colleagues are as well. And one thing that I always try to point people to is media literacy. This idea that when we are engaging with media and social media, we really need to think critically and actively about what we are viewing, what we are seeing, and who we are believing. And I think it's really important for people to engage in this and to be active social media users and not passive social media users. This idea that they need to not necessarily believe everything that they are seeing on social media. And we've seen a push for media literacy, more so in the past few years, and even some high schools are starting to teach media literacy to their students. So I think as more and more people are actively and not passively engaging with social media and critically kind of examining the content that they view, this is going to be really important. And I also think it's really important for individuals to realize that their voices can matter online. The content that you post, the things that you share, the things that you like, this can be really, really influential at affecting others. And so I think keeping this in mind is really important as well.
Do you have any other research based communication tools that listeners could use to communicate better when it comes to like pro social collective action? The likes and the comments, I'm sure that helps definitely.
Yeah, so I think, a really good thing to do is to find these positive pro-social collective actions and be willing to share them with your networks. Again, sharing, liking, providing these positive comments can really go a long way. If you're providing these positive comments and your friends see them, they're going to oftentimes trust what you're saying, or be more likely at least to trust what you're saying and potentially view that pro-social collective action or that organization that's trying to bring about positive change in maybe a little bit more positive manner. And so again, really focusing on trying to engage with these organizations that are trying to bring about something positive can be a really, really powerful thing.
What a wealth of knowledge. All great things to keep in mind. Is there anything important to this discussion about collective action that we didn't get to or that you'd like to mention?
No, so I think I would just kind of end by saying, the influence of social media on collective action is very strong and very powerful. And this can be a positive thing or a negative thing depending on the context. If we're talking about pro-social collective actions, we're talking about, movements like Black Lives Matter, these really kind of organizations that are trying to bring about positive change, then it's a positive relationship. But if we're talking about things like white nationalism and the alt-right and like the Capitol insurrection, it's a really negative thing. So I think, as I was saying, it's very contextual about whether the influence of social media on collective action is going to lead to these positive outcomes or potentially these negative outcomes.
It's so nuanced. We could go on a whole other podcast episode to talk about the little nuances within that. But
Right.
I just want to thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your time and expertise with all of us. I learned a lot, and I hope those of you listening feel the same. Before you go, Dr. Hawkins, I ask all of my before you go, Dr. Hawkins, I ask all of my guests if they have a recommendation for personal or professional development, so like a book or a podcast or a person, anything you like to learn from?
Yeah. So, in relation to like research on social media, I would really highly suggest Professor Dr. Dan Lane, who's a professor at University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as Jessica Roden, who's a doctoral student at the University of Michigan. Both of these two researchers are doing extremely important and interesting research at the intersections of digital media, identity, and social change. So I would 100% suggest checking out the research that these two individuals are engaging in.
Awesome. Well, to all you listening, we just skimmed the surface here, so I will provide those resources for you in the show notes, links so that you can read up on the literature if you so choose, and information on Dr. Ian Hawkins himself. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It was a great experience.
Beautification of communication, the Communification Podcast.